You need to change the name. Those were the first words I heard from my sister-in-law Jessica, her voice sharp and furious through my phone speaker, maybe 4 hours after I'd given birth to my daughter. I was still in the hospital bed, my body aching in ways I hadn't known were possible, my mind foggy from exhaustion and pain medication, and Emily had just stepped out to get us both coffee from the cafeteria down the hall. I'd been dozing, my newborn daughter sleeping in the clear plastic bassinet beside me, when my phone lit up with Jessica's name. I'd answered without thinking, still in that hazy postpartum state where everything felt surreal and distant. "What?" I managed, my voice hoarse from hours of screaming through contractions. "The name," Jessica said, and I could hear she was crying. That particular theatrical crying she did when she wanted something. "Charlotte Rose, you can't use it. I've had that name picked out for years, Maya. Years. Everyone in the family knows it's my name." I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the little holes in them, trying to process what was happening. I'd just endured 19 hours of labor. I'd just brought a human being into the world. My daughter was 4 hours old. And Jessica was calling me to demand I change her name. "Jessica, we already filed the birth certificate," I said quietly, too tired to argue, too tired to explain what she already knew. "Then unfile it," she snapped. "I don't know, I don't care how you do it, but you need to fix this. You knew I wanted that name. You knew, and you used it anyway, and that's just cruel, Maya." I closed my eyes and felt tears sliding down my temples into my hair. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I was supposed to be glowing with new mother joy, bonding with my baby, celebrating with my wife. Instead, I was being berated by my sister-in-law for naming my daughter a name that meant everything to me and Emily, a name we'd chosen years ago, a name that honored my late grandmother and Emily's mother. But that was the thing about Jessica. That was always the thing about Jessica. She was the golden child in Emily's family, the younger sister who'd been indulged and catered to her entire life, and she'd grown into an adult who genuinely believed the world should rearrange itself around her wants. And Emily's family had spent 32 years teaching everyone around them that keeping Jessica happy was more important than anything else, including fairness, including other people's feelings, including the truth. I'd learned this over the 5 years I'd been with Emily, learned it through 1,000 small moments where Jessica's needs took precedence, where I was expected to understand her sensitive nature, where smoothing things over meant I was the one who had to bend. And I'd bent, so many times, because I loved Emily, and I wanted her family to love me too, or at least accept me. But lying there in that hospital bed, my body still trembling with aftershocks of pain, my daughter sleeping peacefully beside me, I felt something shift inside my chest. I was a mother now. I had someone else to protect. Someone whose worth I had to defend even when I couldn't defend my own. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. "I need to call you back," I told Jessica, my thumb already moving to end the call before she could protest further, and I let the phone drop onto the blanket beside me as I stared at my sleeping daughter, and let myself remember the real story of her name, the true story that had nothing to do with Jessica's claims or demands. It had been 3 years ago, maybe 4 months after Emily and I got engaged, and we'd been lying in bed in our apartment in Portland on a lazy Sunday morning, still tangled in sheets and talking about our future in that dreamy way people do when everything still feels possible and uncomplicated. Emily had asked me if I wanted kids, and I'd said yes without hesitation, and then we'd started spinning out this whole fantasy life, laughing about whose genes would produce a better-looking baby, debating whether we'd use a sperm donor or adopt, imagining ourselves as exhausted parents dealing with terrible twos and rebellious teenagers. And then Emily had gotten quiet for a moment, and she'd rolled onto her side to face me, and she'd said, If we have a daughter, I'd want to name her after your grandmother Charlotte. I know how much she meant to you. I'd started crying immediately, not sad tears, but the kind that come from being seen, really seen, by someone who loves you. My grandmother Charlotte had raised me from age 7 to 18, after my mother went through a devastating divorce and a worse depression, and she'd been the most stable, loving presence in my entire childhood. She'd taught me to bake bread and balance a checkbook. She'd sat through every school play and piano recital. She'd been the one who told me it was okay to love whoever I loved when I came out to her at 16. She'd died 2 years before I met Emily, and I still missed her every single day. Emily had never met her, but she'd listened to all my stories, looked through all my photos, understood what Charlotte had meant to me, and now she wanted to honor her by naming our future daughter after her. And maybe Rose as a middle name, Emily had continued, watching my face carefully. For my mom, Charlotte Rose. I'd kissed her then, tasted salt from my own tears, and whispered yes against her mouth. Charlotte Rose. It was perfect. It meant something. It connected our daughter to the women who'd shaped us, who'd loved us, who'd taught us how to be strong. That was 3 years before Jessica ever claimed the name. 3 years before she'd apparently decided she wanted it for herself. And I knew exactly where Jessica's attachment to the name had come from, because Emily had told me, reluctantly, after that disastrous baby shower. Jessica had been watching some period drama on Netflix, something with a beautiful aristocratic character named Charlotte Rose, and she'd decided it sounded elegant and sophisticated. That was it. That was the deep, meaningful connection. She'd liked how it sounded. There was no grandmother Charlotte in her life, no family history, no emotional significance beyond thinking it would look pretty on a monogrammed baby blanket. But Jessica had a gift for convincing herself that whatever she wanted in any given moment was something she'd always wanted, something she deserved, something that had been unfairly taken from her if she didn't get it. I'd been watching Jessica operate this way for 5 years, and the pattern was always the same. She'd see something someone else had, decide she wanted it, and then rewrite history in her mind until she believed she'd wanted it first, deserved it more, been unfairly deprived of it when she didn't get it. Our wedding had been the first time I'd really seen it in action, though Emily had tried to warn me beforehand that her sister could be a bit much when she wasn't the center of attention. I'd chosen my wedding dress carefully, spent weeks looking through boutiques in Portland until I found the perfect one, an elegant A-line gown with delicate lace sleeves and a cathedral train, simple but sophisticated, exactly what I'd always imagined. Jessica had come dress shopping with me, had cooed over how beautiful it was, had taken dozens of photos on her phone while I stood on the fitting platform feeling like a princess. 6 months later, when Jessica married her husband Brad in a ceremony that somehow cost 3 times what ours had despite having half as many guests, she'd walk down the aisle in a dress that was nearly identical to mine. Not inspired by mine, not similar to mine, but practically a replica, down to the lace pattern on the sleeves. When Emily pointed it out to her later, gently, just asking if maybe she'd subconsciously been influenced by my dress, Jessica had acted bewildered and said she'd been planning this exact dress style since she was 12 years old, had drawings in her childhood diary to prove it, couldn't believe Emily would suggest she'd copied anyone. The drawings never materialized, but the family had accepted her explanation and acted like Emily was being oversensitive for even bringing it up. Then there was our honeymoon to Santorini, a trip Emily and I had saved for over a year to afford, researching the perfect hotels and restaurants and sunset viewing spots, boring everyone at family dinners with our enthusiastic planning for months before the wedding. Jessica and Brad had gone to Mexico for their honeymoon, which Jessica had announced she'd always dreamed of visiting, but 2 years later, when they took their anniversary trip to Santorini and stayed at the exact same hotel we'd stayed at, visited the exact same wineries we'd recommended, Jessica posted photos with captions about how she'd finally made it to her dream destination and how she'd always wanted to watch the sunset in Oya. When I'd mentioned to Emily that it felt strange, Jessica had suddenly developed this lifelong dream of visiting the exact place we'd spent our honeymoon. Emily had sighed and said her sister had probably just remembered how happy we'd been there and wanted that for herself too. And wasn't it kind of flattering in a way? And couldn't I just let it go? So I'd let it go. But the worst had been our actual wedding reception, the moment that should have been entirely ours. When Jessica and Brad had clinked their glasses during dinner to make an announcement, and Jessica had stood up glowing and declared that they'd just gotten engaged that morning, and wasn't it perfect that they could celebrate with the whole family already gathered together? Emily's parents had erupted in tears and hugs. Half the reception had mobbed Jessica's table to see her ring, and Emily and I had stood there in our wedding dresses watching our celebration become Jessica's engagement party. Later, when Emily had asked her sister if maybe she could have waited one day to announce, Jessica had cried and said she'd just been so happy and caught up in the romantic atmosphere that Brad had surprised her with the proposal that morning and it had felt like fate. And how could Emily be so selfish as to not want to share joy with her only sister? And Emily's parents had agreed that it was beautiful how the family could celebrate two wonderful milestones together, and I'd swallowed my hurt and smiled through the rest of the night while people kept congratulating Jessica and mentioning our wedding as an afterthought. The pattern had been clear for years, but I'd always told myself I was reading too much into it, being oversensitive, letting my own insecurities make me see slights where none existed, and I'd kept that narrative going right up until 4 months ago when Emily and I had announced my pregnancy at a family dinner at Rose and David's house in Lake Oswego. We'd waited until I was safely past the first trimester, had seen the heartbeat twice, had gotten the results back from all the genetic testing showing everything looked healthy and normal, and we'd been so excited to share the news, had even brought a little gift bag for Rose with a picture frame that said Grandma on it, and a printout of our ultrasound photo tucked inside. I'd been nervous in a good way, the kind of anticipation that feels like champagne bubbles in your chest, because this was our first baby, and I'd thought everyone would be as thrilled as we were. Rose had opened the gift bag at the dinner table, had pulled out the frame and stared at it for a moment, looking confused. And then when she'd seen the ultrasound photo, her face had transformed into pure joy, and she'd actually screamed and jumped up to hug us both. David had teared up, had shaken my hand and then pulled me into a hug instead. And for about 3 minutes, it had been everything I'd hoped for, everyone talking at once, asking questions about due dates and whether we knew the sex yet and whether I was feeling okay. And then Jessica had set down her wine glass with just enough force to make it clink loudly against the table, and all the attention had swung to her like iron filings to a magnet, and she'd said, "Oh my God, that's such amazing timing because Brad and I have been talking about trying soon too." Just like that, the conversation had shifted. Rose had immediately turned to Jessica and asked when they were planning to start trying, and Jessica had launched into this detailed explanation of how they'd been discussing it for months, how Brad had just gotten a promotion that would make the timing perfect, how she'd already been taking prenatal vitamins and tracking her cycle. Emily had tried to steer the conversation back a few times, mentioning my due date or asking if anyone wanted to know what cravings I'd been having, but Jessica had somehow made every topic circle back to her future hypothetical pregnancy. She'd asked me intrusive questions about our sperm donor that made me deeply uncomfortable, wanting to know how much we'd paid, what the process was like, whether I'd had to do IVF or if it had worked with just insemination. Questions that felt less like curiosity and more like she was gathering data for some future competition. And I'd noticed, even though I'd tried not to, that Rose and David had seemed almost more excited about Jessica's potential future pregnancy than about my actual current one. Rose had spent 10 minutes talking to Jessica about how she'd always dreamed of having two grandchildren close in age who could grow up together like sisters. And David had joked about how Jessica's baby and ours could be best friends, and I'd sat there feeling my excitement drain away, feeling like an opening act for the main event that everyone was really waiting for. Emily had noticed too. I could tell from the way her jaw had tightened, and her hand had found mine under the table and squeezed hard. But neither of us had said anything, because what could we say without sounding petty or jealous, or like we wanted to deny Jessica her own happiness? The baby shower was 2 months before my due date. A beautiful afternoon in early September at Rose and David's house with their backyard decorated in soft yellows and greens, since we'd decided not to find out the baby's sex. And I'd felt genuinely happy for the first time in weeks, surrounded by friends and family who seemed actually excited about our baby, rather than treating the pregnancy like a preliminary event before Jessica's inevitable superior performance. Rose had been wonderful that day, attentive and warm, asking me how I was feeling and making sure I was comfortable in the cushioned chair they'd set up for me in the shade. And about halfway through the shower, when we were opening gifts, she'd sat down next to me and taken my hand and asked if Emily and I had chosen a name yet. I'd hesitated because we'd been keeping it private, wanting to hold something back that felt just ours, but Rose had looked so hopeful and genuine that I'd glanced at Emily across the yard, and Emily had smiled and nodded. And so I'd told Rose that we'd chosen Charlotte Rose, explaining that Charlotte was my grandmother's name and Rose was of course for her. Rose's eyes had filled with tears immediately, the kind of tears that come from being genuinely moved, and she'd put her hand over her heart and said that was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever done for her, that she couldn't imagine a greater honor than having her granddaughter carry her name. It had been a perfect moment, exactly what I'd hoped for. Rose hugging me and Emily both and crying happy tears, and I'd felt this rush of warmth and belonging like maybe I really was part of this family after all, and not just the woman who'd married into it. And then Jessica had arrived, 45 minutes late as usual, making a grand entrance with apologies about traffic that probably weren't true, and she'd immediately noticed that Rose was crying and had rushed over asking what was wrong, and Rose had said nothing was wrong, everything was wonderful. Maya and Emily had just told her the baby's name. I'd watched Jessica's face as Rose had repeated the name Charlotte Rose, watched her expression shift from curiosity to something I couldn't quite read, something that might have been surprise or might have been calculation, and then she'd smiled brightly and said that was lovely and congratulated us, but something in her tone had felt off. 20 minutes later, Jessica had pulled Emily aside into the house, and I'd watched through the French doors as they'd stood in the kitchen having what looked like an intense conversation, Jessica talking rapidly and Emily's face growing more and more distressed. And when Emily had finally come back outside, she'd looked shaken and had pulled me aside and told me in a quiet voice that Jessica was upset because apparently she'd been planning to use the name Charlotte Rose for years and felt like we'd stolen it from her. I'd stared at Emily, waiting for her to laugh or indicate she was joking, but she'd been serious, and the rest of the shower had passed in a blur of forced smiles while I'd processed the fact that Jessica had somehow impossibly found a way to make our baby's name about her. 3 days after the baby shower, Emily's phone rang while we were having breakfast, and I knew from the way her face changed when she looked at the screen that it was her parents, and I felt my stomach drop even before she answered and put it on speaker so I could hear. Rose's voice came through warm, but with that particular tone I'd learned to recognize over the years. The one that meant she was about to ask for something she expected us to agree to. And she started by asking how I was feeling and whether the baby had been moving much. Small talk that felt like she was working up to something. Then David's voice joined in, and Rose said they'd been thinking a lot about the baby shower, and how wonderful it was that we'd chosen to honor family with the name, and I felt myself tense because I knew what was coming, could feel it approaching like a wave you can see building far out in the ocean. David cleared his throat and said they wanted to talk to us about Jessica, about how upset she'd been, and Rose jumped in quickly to say that of course they understood the name was meaningful to us, no one was questioning that, but Jessica had apparently been planning to use Charlotte Rose for years and was devastated that we'd chosen it. I opened my mouth to point out that Jessica had never mentioned this alleged plan to anyone before our shower, but Emily shot me a look and I stayed quiet, and David continued saying that maybe we could all take a step back and think about what was best for family harmony. Rose suggested gently that perhaps we could consider using Charlotte Rose as a middle name instead, or maybe just Charlotte, or maybe Rose as a middle name with a different first name, and there were so many beautiful names out there, and surely we could find one that didn't cause this kind of family conflict. I felt like I'd been slapped, felt heat rising in my face and my hands starting to shake, and Emily was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone white, and she said in a voice that sounded nothing like her usual tone that the name honored her mother and Maya's grandmother, and we'd chosen it years ago. Rose made a soft sound like she was trying not to cry and said she was deeply honored, but she'd be just as honored if her name was part of a middle name. And what mattered most was family peace, and Jessica was so fragile right now, and couldn't we please just consider it? Emily looked at me, and I could see she was wavering. Could see the years of conditioning kicking in, the lifetime of being told to accommodate her sister's feelings, and she said slowly that maybe we could think about it, and something inside me broke. I said no, my voice coming out harder than I'd intended, and there was silence on the other end of the phone, and I said the name was chosen, it was meaningful to us, and I wasn't changing it because Jessica had suddenly decided she wanted it. David said in that reasonable tone that made me feel like I was being unreasonable that no one was forcing us to do anything. They were just asking us to consider Jessica's feelings. And I felt tears starting because I was being made to feel selfish for wanting to name my own daughter the name Emily, and I had chosen together years before Jessica had even pretended to care about it. The call ended shortly after with awkward goodbyes, and Emily and I sat in silence for a long moment before she said quietly that maybe we should at least think about whether it was worth the fight. And we had our first real argument then, me saying I couldn't believe she was considering giving in to this manipulation, and her saying I didn't understand what it was like having Jessica as a sister, how exhausting it was, how sometimes it was easier to just let her have what she wanted. I held firm, though my hands were shaking and my voice kept breaking. And eventually Emily backed down and said she'd support whatever I decided. But the tension hung between us for the rest of the day, and I felt more alone than I had since we'd gotten married. Felt like I was fighting this battle by myself, even though it was our baby and our choice. Jessica started her campaign the day after the phone call with Rose and David, and it was subtle at first, the kind of thing that could almost seem innocent if you didn't know her patterns. Emily's phone would light up with texts from Jessica at odd hours, links to articles with titles like The Sacred Bond Between Sisters, and Why Family Harmony Matters More Than Being Right, and Compromising with Grace, A Guide to Keeping Peace. And each link came with a brief message from Jessica saying things like, "Thought of you when I read this," or "This really spoke to me about our situation." Emily would show me these texts with increasing frustration, and I could see her starting to recognize the manipulation for what it was. But Jessica was relentless, sending something every day or two, keeping the pressure constant, but never quite crossing the line into obvious harassment. Then about a week after our argument, Jessica started posting on social media, and that was when I realized she was escalating from private pressure to public narrative building. The first post was a photo of a soft pink blanket with roses embroidered on it, caption reading, "Starting to collect things for my future daughter Charlotte Rose," with a heart emoji and a rose emoji, and I'd stared at that post feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach because Jessica wasn't even pregnant as far as we knew. Emily had called her immediately and asked what she was doing, and Jessica had said innocently that she and Brad were trying to conceive and she was just so excited about the name she'd always dreamed of using. And didn't Emily think it was beautiful? And Emily had said through gritted teeth that yes, it was beautiful, which was why we'd chosen it for our daughter who actually existed and was going to be born in 6 weeks. But Jessica's posts continued, a steady stream of baby items all in pink and white and rose gold, everything carefully styled and photographed, little outfits with monogrammed CR on them, a wooden sign reading Charlotte Rose, in script lettering that Jessica said was going to hang in her nursery, a collection of children's books with notes about reading them to my Charlotte Rose someday. And each post got dozens of likes and comments from family members saying how sweet it was and how excited they were to meet baby Charlotte Rose eventually. Emily showed me the family group chat that I'd never been added to, the one with all her aunts and uncles and cousins. And it was full of messages about Jessica's nursery planning, everyone enthusiastically discussing paint colors and furniture arrangements, and whether Jessica should go with a rose garden theme or a more modern botanical look. And there was something surreal about watching Emily's entire extended family engage with Jessica's hypothetical future baby while barely acknowledging that Emily and I had an actual baby arriving in a matter of weeks. I felt my anger building with each post, each monogrammed item, each family member's enthusiastic comment, felt it crystallizing into something hard and immovable in my chest. And Emily was getting angrier too, finally seeing clearly what I'd been seeing for years. Finally recognizing that this wasn't about a name or about Jessica's feelings, but about control and attention, and Jessica's need to be the center of every narrative. The worst part was watching the joy drain out of our pregnancy's final weeks, the way I found myself obsessively checking Jessica's social media to see what she'd posted, the way every family text made my heart race with anxiety about what new manipulation was coming, and I hated that Jessica had managed to steal this time from us, even though our baby wasn't even born yet, and the name was still ours to give. 3 weeks before my due date, we went to dinner at Rose and David's house, and I'd spent the entire drive there with my stomach in knots that had nothing to do with the third trimester discomfort I'd been experiencing, because Emily had warned me that Jessica would be there, and I knew there was going to be some kind of scene, could feel it coming the way you can feel a storm building in the air. When we arrived, Jessica was already holding court in the living room with several of Emily's aunts clustered around her, and spread across the coffee table was what looked like a scrapbook or photo album. And as we got closer, I could see it was a baby book, one of those elaborate ones with slots for ultrasound pictures and spaces to record milestones and dreams for the future, and across the cover in elegant gold lettering it said, Charlotte Rose. Jessica looked up as we entered, and her face did this thing where surprise flickered across it for just a second before settling into determined brightness. And she said loudly enough for everyone to hear that she was just showing everyone the memory book she'd started for her future daughter, and wasn't it beautiful? And she'd found it at this darling boutique and just had to get the name embossed because she'd been planning it for so long. I felt Emily's hand tighten on mine, and I stood there looking at that book with my actual daughter moving inside me, pressing against my ribs, real and present, and arriving in a matter of weeks. And I watched Jessica's performance as she turned pages showing printouts of nursery inspiration photos and lists of potential middle names to go with Charlotte Rose, and a family tree she'd drawn up, showing where the name would fit in her future family. And every person in that room was cooing over it like it was reasonable. Like Jessica wasn't creating an elaborate fantasy about a baby that didn't exist, while I stood there visibly pregnant with a baby who did. Something snapped inside me, and I heard myself say, my voice cutting through the admiring comments, "We already chose that name." And the room went silent, everyone turning to look at me, and Jessica's eyes went wide and started to fill with tears immediately, like she'd been waiting for her cue. She said in a trembling voice that she'd told us how much this name meant to her, how she'd been dreaming of her Charlotte Rose for years, and how could we be so cruel as to take it from her? And I said that we'd chosen the name years ago to honor my grandmother and Emily's mother, and we'd announced it at our baby shower, and Jessica stood up abruptly and ran from the room with her hands over her face, and I heard a door slam somewhere in the house. Rose turned on me immediately, her face flushed with anger, and said I had no right to ruin a family dinner by upsetting Jessica like that. Couldn't I see how fragile she was? And David chimed in saying there were thousands of beautiful names in the world, and surely Emily and I could find one that didn't cause this kind of family conflict. I felt tears starting because I was exhausted and hugely pregnant and being made to feel like a villain for wanting to name my daughter the name we'd chosen. And then Emily's voice cut through sharp and furious, saying that we had chosen the name first, announced it first, and had an actual baby arriving in 3 weeks who would be named Charlotte Rose, regardless of Jessica's theater. And her family needed to stop enabling Jessica's manipulative behavior and start acting like they cared about our baby at all. Rose gasped like Emily had slapped her and started to say something about respecting elders, but Emily was already grabbing our coats and pulling me toward the door, and we left with multiple family members calling after us about being reasonable and not leaving angry and thinking about Jessica's feelings. The car ride home was silent for the first few miles, my hands shaking in my lap and Emily's jaw clenched tight. And then she pulled over into a parking lot and turned to me and said she was done. Completely done with her family's inability to see how toxic Jessica's behavior was. And she promised me that no matter what happened, no matter how much pressure came from her family, she would support me and our daughter would be named Charlotte Rose. I cried then, hard, all the tension and fear and anger of the past months pouring out, and Emily held me as well as she could around my enormous belly. And when we finally drove home, I felt vindicated, but also utterly exhausted, drained by the constant battle that should never have been a battle at all. Labor started 2 days after that disastrous dinner, and in some ways I was grateful because it gave me something else to focus on, besides the ongoing family disaster. Something immediate and physical and entirely mine and Emily's. My water broke at 3 in the morning, and we drove to the hospital through empty streets, with Emily trying to stay calm, but gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. And I remember thinking through the contractions that at least for the next however many hours, the only thing that mattered was bringing our daughter safely into the world. The labor was long, 17 hours from start to finish. And there were moments when the pain was so consuming that I forgot about Jessica entirely, forgot about the name drama and the family pressure and everything except breathing through each contraction with Emily, coaching me and holding my hand and telling me I was strong, I was doing amazingly, our baby was almost here. And then finally, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, they placed her on my chest, this tiny, perfect creature with a scrunched red face and dark hair plastered to her head, and I looked down at her and felt something shift fundamentally in my universe. Felt every priority rearrange itself around this new center of gravity. Emily was crying and I was crying, and our daughter was making these small mewling sounds, and the nurse said, "She's perfect. Congratulations, what's her name?" And I looked at this baby girl and knew with absolute certainty that she was Charlotte Rose, had always been Charlotte Rose, would always be Charlotte Rose regardless of what anyone else thought or wanted or demanded. Emily must have seen it in my face because she squeezed my hand and nodded. And when the hospital staff brought the birth certificate paperwork about an hour later, after they'd cleaned our daughter and done all the checks, and I was settled in the recovery room with Charlotte sleeping on my chest, we filled it out together without hesitation or discussion. Emily wrote carefully in the blank spaces, Charlotte Rose Martinez Chen, born October 15th at 8:47 p.m., 7 pounds 3 ounces, 20 inches long, and we both signed our names at the bottom, making it official, making it real, making it ours. I watched Emily take the completed paperwork, and I saw the determination in her face, saw her walk to the door with that clipboard held firmly in her hands, and she told me she was going to take it to the hospital records office herself right then, wasn't going to let it sit at the nurse's station, or trust it to be processed later. And I understood what she wasn't saying, that she was afraid someone from her family might try to interfere, or delay it, or convince us to change our minds. She was gone for 20 minutes, and when she came back she said, "It's done, it's filed, it's in the system. She's officially Charlotte Rose." And I felt relief wash over me so powerful it was almost physical, because our daughter's name was no longer theoretical or debatable. It was legal and final, and no amount of Jessica's tears or family pressure could change it now. Emily climbed carefully into the hospital bed beside me, and we lay there together with Charlotte between us, our little family of 3, and for the first time in months, I felt genuine peace. Felt like we'd won something important, not through cruelty or spite, but simply by standing firm in what was right and meaningful for us. The call came 6 hours after Charlotte was born, while I was dozing in that exhausted, half-sleep state where you're never quite unconscious because you're listening for your newborn's breathing. And Emily's phone started buzzing on the rolling table next to my hospital bed, vibrating insistently until Emily grabbed it and I heard her say, "Jessica?" in a confused, sleepy voice that quickly sharpened into alertness. I pulled myself more upright, wincing at the pain, and watched Emily's face change as she listened. Watched her expression move from confusion to disbelief to anger, and then she was saying, "How did you even know? We haven't told anyone yet." And I realized with a sinking feeling that somehow Jessica had found out about the birth, and more importantly about the name. Emily put the phone on speaker, and Jessica's voice filled the room, high-pitched and furious, saying, "I have a friend who works in hospital records and she told me you filed the birth certificate with Charlotte Rose. How could you do this to me? You knew I wanted that name. You knew how important it was to me." I felt something crack open inside me. All the exhaustion and pain and hormones and months of accumulated frustrations suddenly flooding out, and I reached for the phone and Emily handed it to me, and I said, "Jessica, we chose this name years ago to honor my grandmother who died, and Emily's mother who is standing right there in the room with you. Probably, this name means something to us. It's not about you." Jessica's voice went even higher, almost a shriek, and she said, "I don't care about your dead grandmother. I called it first. I told you I wanted it and you used it anyway just to hurt me." And I felt Emily go rigid beside me, felt her snatch the phone back from my hand, and she said in a voice I'd never heard her use before, cold and hard and final, "You never called anything. You heard us announce the name at our baby shower and decided you wanted it because that's what you do. You take things that matter to other people, and I am done, completely done, pretending your behavior is acceptable. Our daughter's name is Charlotte Rose Martinez Chen, and it's filed and legal, and you need to stop calling us about this." She hung up while Jessica was still talking, just pressed the end button and then turned off her phone entirely, and then she climbed into the hospital bed beside me, carefully, gently, and wrapped her arms around me while I cried, great heaving sobs that I couldn't control, tears streaming down my face while Charlotte slept peacefully in her bassinet, completely unaware of the storm raging around her existence. Emily held me and stroked my hair and kept saying, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you have to deal with this right now. You just gave birth to our daughter, and instead of resting, you're dealing with my sister's tantrum." And I cried harder because I felt relief that Emily was fully on my side, and guilt that I'd caused this family explosion, and anger that I had to feel guilty at all when we'd done nothing wrong. And underneath all of it was this bone-deep exhaustion that made me wonder if standing our ground was worth the cost we were clearly going to have to pay. The next morning, Emily turned her phone back on, and it immediately started buzzing like an angry hornet, message after message flooding in, and I watched her face as she scrolled through them, watched her expression harden with each new notification, and she started reading some of them aloud in a flat, disbelieving voice. Her mother had texted at 6 in the morning saying, "We need to talk about this situation. You girls need to work this out. Jessica is beside herself." And her father had sent a message an hour later that said, "Very disappointed in how you're handling this. Maya has driven a wedge into this family and you're letting her." And there were texts from Jessica's husband Brad calling Emily selfish and accusing her of deliberately hurting his wife, and messages from aunts and uncles and cousins all weighing in with opinions about our daughter's name, as if they had any right to an opinion at all. Emily's phone rang while she was still scrolling, and she answered it, and I heard her mother's voice even from where I sat in the hospital bed, high and distressed, saying, "Jessica has locked herself in her bedroom. She won't eat. She won't talk to anyone. She's devastated, Emily. You have to fix this." Emily's jaw tightened and she said, "There's nothing to fix, Mom. The name is filed, it's legal, it's final, and more importantly, it's meaningful to us. It honors Maya's grandmother, and it honors you. And I don't understand why you're not touched by that, instead of upset about Jessica's tantrum." And Rose made a sound like Emily had slapped her and said, "This isn't a tantrum. Your sister is genuinely hurt, and I don't understand how you can be so cruel when you know how sensitive she is." I watched Emily close her eyes and take a deep breath and say, "Our daughter is 1 day old. I'm in a hospital room with my wife who just went through 17 hours of labor, and instead of you congratulating us or asking how we're doing or wanting to meet your granddaughter, you're calling to tell me I need to manage Jessica's feelings about a name that belongs to our child. Do you hear how insane that is?" And then her father's voice came through the phone. Apparently, he was there too, saying, "Don't speak to your mother that way. This is exactly the kind of behavior we're talking about. You're being selfish and inconsiderate." Emily held the phone away from her face for a moment, and I saw tears in her eyes, but also steel, and she brought it back and said, "My daughter's name is Charlotte Rose Martinez Chen. She was born yesterday at 8:47 p.m. She weighs 7 pounds 3 ounces, and she's perfect. And if you want to be part of her life, you need to accept her name and stop trying to police our choices." And then she hung up before they could respond. She turned to look at me, and I must have looked stricken because she came over and sat on the edge of the hospital bed and said, "Don't feel guilty. You have nothing to feel guilty about." But I did feel guilty, felt it sitting heavy in my chest, even though I knew rationally we'd done nothing wrong. A nurse came in about an hour later to check my vitals, and she smiled at Charlotte sleeping in my arms and said, "What a beautiful baby. What's her name?" And I said, "Charlotte Rose." And the nurse said, "Oh, that's lovely. Is it a family name?" And I found myself explaining, "Yes, Charlotte for my grandmother who raised me and Rose for my wife's mother." And the nurse's face softened, and she said, "That's so meaningful. She'll grow up knowing she was named with love and intention." And I felt something ease slightly in my chest. Felt validation from this stranger who had no agenda or family loyalty, just genuine appreciation for the thought we'd put into our daughter's name. That second night, Emily went down to the cafeteria to get us both coffee and something that vaguely resembled food, and I was alone with Charlotte for the first time since all the phone calls and messages and family explosion. Just the two of us in the quiet hospital room, with only the soft beeping of monitors and the hushed sounds of nurses in the hallway outside. I held her against my chest, felt her tiny warm weight, watched her perfect little face as she slept with that absolute trust that newborns have, completely dependent and completely unaware of the chaos swirling around her existence, and I felt something crack open in my chest. A question I didn't want to ask myself but couldn't avoid anymore. Was this worth it? Was standing firm on a name worth destroying Emily's relationship with her family? Worth the tears I'd seen in Emily's eyes when her mother had chosen Jessica's feelings over meeting her granddaughter? Worth the stress and anger and guilt that was poisoning what should have been the happiest time of our lives? I looked down at Charlotte and whispered, "I'm sorry," even though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. Sorry that she'd been born into this mess, or sorry that I was considering backing down, or sorry that her mother was doubting herself when she should have been resting and recovering and bonding with her baby. The doubt felt familiar, settling over me like an old coat I'd worn so many times. I knew exactly how it fit. And I realized with a jolt that this was a pattern I'd been living my whole life, this constant calculation of whether standing up for myself was worth the conflict it would cause. I thought about my younger brother Marcus, and how my parents had always asked me to be the reasonable one, the flexible one, the one who could compromise because Marcus was going through something or having a hard time, or just, that's how he is. And I remembered being 12 years old and giving up my planned birthday party at the amusement park because Marcus had thrown a fit about wanting to go to the science museum instead, and my mother had looked at me with tired eyes and said, "You understand, don't you, Maya? You're so good at understanding." I'd learned young that my needs mattered less than someone else's wants, that peace was more important than fairness, that being accommodating was a virtue even when it meant swallowing my own disappointment over and over until I barely noticed I was doing it anymore. I'd carried that lesson into my relationship with Emily's family, had spent 4 years smoothing over my own hurt feelings when Jessica took things that mattered to me, Had told myself I was being mature and gracious, when really I was just being trained, performing the same role I'd learned in childhood. I looked at Charlotte's face, at her delicate eyelashes and her rosebud mouth, and her tiny fingers curled against my hospital gown, and I thought about what kind of mother I wanted to be, what lessons I would teach her about her own worth. Did I want her to grow up watching me cave to unreasonable demands, learning that keeping peace was more important than standing firm in what's right? Did I want her to internalize the message that other people's feelings mattered more than her own boundaries? That she should make herself smaller to accommodate someone else's tantrum? The answer came clear and certain, cutting through all the guilt and doubt like a blade. No, Charlotte Rose deserved a mother who stood firm, who showed her that sometimes the right choice is the hard choice, that you don't negotiate your truth to make someone else comfortable with their manipulation. I pressed my lips to her forehead, breathed in that perfect new baby smell, and felt the doubt drain away, replaced by something harder and cleaner. We'd chosen her name with love and meaning and intention, and that was enough, more than enough, regardless of whether Emily's family could accept it or not. Discharge day arrived on the third morning, and I was both relieved to leave the hospital and anxious about going home to whatever waited for us there. And Emily was helping me get dressed while Charlotte slept in her bassinet when a nurse knocked and said, "You have visitors," with a careful expression that made my stomach drop. Emily's parents walked in, and the air immediately felt heavy with tension, and I saw Rose's eyes go to the bassinet first, lingering on her sleeping granddaughter, before she looked at Emily, but not at me, wouldn't meet my eyes at all. David stood with his arms crossed and said, "We need to discuss this situation as a family." And Emily said, "No, we don't. There's nothing to discuss." And I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. 3 days of fighting with her family when she should have been resting and celebrating. Rose said, "Emily, please, we just want to talk. We want to meet our granddaughter properly." And she still wasn't looking at me, was acting like I wasn't even in the room, like I was a piece of furniture she could ignore. Emily's jaw tightened and she said, "The situation is over. Our daughter's name is Charlotte Rose. It's on her birth certificate. It's legal and final. And we're not changing it or discussing it or negotiating about it anymore." And David made an exasperated sound and said, "You're being unreasonable. You know Jessica is devastated. You know this has caused unnecessary conflict. And you're choosing to dig in your heels instead of being flexible." I stood there holding Charlotte's diaper bag, feeling invisible and hurt and angry all at once, and Emily said, "I'm choosing my wife and my daughter over my sister's tantrum about a name that means something important to us and nothing to her, except that she wants what we have." And Rose finally looked at me then, her eyes red like she'd been crying, and said, "Can I hold her?" I hesitated, wanted to say no out of petty hurt, but Emily nodded at me, and I went to the bassinet and carefully lifted Charlotte, who stirred but didn't wake, and I handed her to Rose because she was Emily's mother and Charlotte's grandmother, regardless of how she'd behaved. Rose's face crumpled when she held Charlotte, tears spilling over, and she whispered, "She's beautiful. She's so beautiful," and stroked Charlotte's cheek with one finger. And I saw something shift in her expression, something soften, as she looked down at this tiny person who shared her name. She said quietly, "Charlotte Rose," like she was tasting the words. And then, "Thank you for honoring me." And it was the first acknowledgement she'd given that the name meant something beyond Jessica's claim to it. The moment felt fragile, like we might be turning a corner, and then Rose's phone rang in her purse, and David pulled it out and glanced at the screen and said, "It's Jessica," and handed it to Rose, and Rose shifted Charlotte in her arms and answered, putting it on speaker without asking if we minded. Jessica's voice came through high and excited, saying, "Mom, I need to tell you something. I need to tell everyone." And Rose said, "What is it, honey?" And Jessica said, "I'm pregnant." The silence in the room felt like a held breath, and then Jessica continued, "I just got a positive test this morning. I'm pregnant, and before anyone says anything, I'm still using the name Charlotte Rose. We picked it out and I love it, and I'm not changing my mind just because Maya decided to steal it. So her baby will just have to be called something else, or we'll both have daughters with the same name, and everyone will just have to deal with it. Emily reached over and took the phone from her mother's hand and hung up without saying a word. And then she looked at her parents and said, "We're going home now. You can have a relationship with your granddaughter if you accept her name and stop enabling Jessica's behavior, or you can choose Jessica's feelings over your granddaughter's existence, but you can't have both." And she took Charlotte from Rose's arms and handed her back to me and picked up our bags, and we walked out of that hospital room and didn't look back. That evening, after we got home and settled Charlotte in her bassinet in our bedroom, and Emily ordered Thai food because neither of us had the energy to cook, I made the mistake of checking my phone and saw that Jessica had posted her pregnancy announcement on social media, one of those carefully staged photos with baby shoes and a positive pregnancy test, and a caption that read, "We're expecting our miracle baby in March. Baby girl Charlotte Rose is already so loved, and we can't wait to meet our daughter. Hash baby on the way. Charlotte Rose. March baby. Blessed and grateful." And I felt the air leave my lungs like I'd been punched. The post was already flooded with comments, dozens of them, from Emily's aunts and uncles and cousins and family friends, all saying congratulations and beautiful name and so happy for you and Charlotte Rose is perfect, like our actual living breathing 3-day-old daughter with that exact name didn't exist at all. I scrolled through the comments looking for any acknowledgement of the reality that Charlotte Rose Martinez Chen had been born just days ago, that the name was already taken and filed and legal, but there was nothing, just an avalanche of enthusiasm for Jessica's claimed name for her 8-week embryo. Emily's Aunt Karen had commented, "I've always loved that name, so classic and beautiful. Perfect choice." And Emily's cousin Mike wrote, "Can't wait to meet little Charlotte." And even Rose had commented with a string of heart emojis and "our beautiful granddaughter." And I felt invisible, erased, like the past 3 days and 9 months before that. And all the years Emily and I had loved that name had simply been wiped from existence. Emily came into the bedroom and saw my face and said, "What's wrong?" And I handed her my phone without speaking, watched her face go from confusion to shock to rage as she read through Jessica's post and the comments. She said, "I'm commenting right now. I'm posting Charlotte's birth announcement right on this post so everyone knows the truth." And she was already typing furiously, but I reached over and put my hand on her phone and said, "Don't." Emily looked at me like I'd lost my mind and said, "Maya, we can't let her just pretend our daughter doesn't exist. We can't let her rewrite reality like this." But I shook my head and said, "Everyone who matters knows the truth. Your parents were at the hospital today. They held Charlotte. They know she's real, and her name is Charlotte Rose, and it's on her birth certificate. And Jessica can post whatever fantasy she wants on social media, but it doesn't change the facts." Emily's hands were shaking and she said, "But all these people commenting, they think Jessica chose the name first. They think we're the ones who will have to change, or we'll both have daughters with the same name. And I can't stand everyone believing her lies." And I understood her fury, because I felt it too. That helpless rage at being erased and invalidated. But I also felt something else. Something quieter and more certain. I said, "Let her have her social media moment. Let her pretend whatever she wants to pretend. Because in March, either she'll have a daughter and have to choose a different name when she realizes we're not backing down, or she won't. And either way, our Charlotte is already here and already named, and nothing Jessica posts online changes that reality." And I realized as I said it that this was the first time I'd chosen not to engage with Jessica's manipulation, the first time I'd decided that proving myself right mattered less than protecting my own peace. 3 weeks passed in a kind of bubble where the world narrowed to just the three of us, Maya and Emily and Charlotte, and we didn't reach out to Emily's family and they didn't reach out to us except for one text from David asking if we needed anything that Emily answered with, "No, we're fine," and nothing more. My parents came to visit when Charlotte was 10 days old, and my mother held her and cried happy tears and said, "She's perfect, and Charlotte Rose is a perfect name. Your grandmother would be so proud." And my father looked at me with such tenderness and said, "You did good, Maya. You stood up for what mattered and you didn't back down." And I realized how much I'd needed that validation from someone. That acknowledgement that I hadn't been unreasonable or cruel, but simply firm about something that was rightfully mine. My mother asked carefully about Emily's family, and I told her the whole story, everything from Jessica's phone call in the hospital to the social media post, to the 3 weeks of silence, and my mother shook her head and said, "I dealt with something similar when you were born. My sister wanted to use the name Maya for her daughter, and got angry when I used it first, and she didn't speak to me for 6 months. But eventually she got over it, because the truth is nobody owns a name, and there's no such thing as calling it first." And hearing that story made me feel less alone, less crazy, like this kind of family drama had precedents and survivable endings. Emily was struggling more than I was with the estrangement from her family. I could see it in the way she'd stare at her phone sometimes, like she was willing it to ring, in the way she'd get quiet when Charlotte did something new, and I knew she was thinking about how her parents were missing these moments. And one night when Charlotte was 2 weeks old, Emily said, "I miss my mom, I miss my family, but I don't regret standing up for you, for us. I just wish it didn't have to be this way." And I held her while she cried and told her I understood, and I was sorry she was caught in the middle, even though none of this was our fault. We took Charlotte to her 2-week pediatrician appointment, and Dr. Patel reviewed her chart and said, "Charlotte Rose Martinez Chen, what a beautiful name. Does it have special meaning?" And I explained about my grandmother and Emily's mother, and Dr. Patel smiled and said, "That's lovely. She'll grow up knowing she was named with such intention and love." And something about a neutral third party using Charlotte's full name so naturally, treating it as simply her name without any drama attached, made it feel more real and legitimate and ours. Emily's confidence seemed to grow after that appointment too, like she needed the reinforcement that we'd made a good choice, and Charlotte was thriving, and the name suited her perfectly. And that night she said, "I don't regret anything. I need you to know that. I chose you and Charlotte, and I'll choose you every time." And I believed her, even though I could see the grief she carried about her family. 6 weeks after Charlotte was born, when we'd finally established something like a rhythm with feeding and sleeping and the exhausting, beautiful chaos of new parenthood, Emily's phone rang with a call from her cousin Rebecca, and I watched Emily's face shift from surprise to wariness as she answered and said, "Hi, Rebecca. It's been a while." I was nursing Charlotte on the couch and could hear Rebecca's voice through the speaker, bright and cheerful like the past 6 weeks of family rupture hadn't happened, saying, "Hey, Em, I'm calling because I'm hosting Jessica's baby shower next Saturday at my place. And I wanted to make sure you got the invitation. I sent it to your email but wasn't sure if you'd seen it." Emily's jaw tightened and she said, "I did see it, and I'm not going to be able to make it. But thanks for the invitation." And Rebecca's voice lost some of its cheerfulness as she said, "Emily, come on, you have to come. You're her sister, and you need to get over this whole name thing. Jessica is really hurt, and this family drama needs to end." I felt my stomach clench at the casual dismissal of everything that had happened, the way Rebecca said, "this whole name thing," like it was a trivial disagreement instead of Jessica's attempt to claim something that was already ours. And Emily must have felt the same anger because her voice went hard as she said, "Rebecca, I'm going to explain this one time and then I'm done. Maya and I chose the name Charlotte Rose 3 years ago. We announced it at our baby shower 2 months before Charlotte was born. We gave birth to Charlotte 6 weeks ago. And we filed her birth certificate with that name the day she was born. Jessica knew all of this and announced she was pregnant and planning to use the same name anyway." There was silence on the other end, and then Rebecca said slowly, "Wait, Jessica told everyone she announced that name years ago, at her wedding. She said you guys knew she wanted it and used it anyway." And I could hear genuine confusion in her voice, the first hint that maybe Jessica's version of events hadn't been entirely accurate. Emily said, I was at Jessica's wedding 4 years ago, Rebecca. You were too. Do you remember her ever mentioning the name Charlotte Rose? And there was another long pause before Rebecca said quietly, "No, actually, I don't. I don't think I ever heard Jessica talk about baby names at all until after your baby shower." And I felt something shift in the room, some small crack in the wall of family solidarity that had been built around Jessica's lies. Emily pressed the advantage and said, "Jessica saw that Maya was pregnant and heard the name we'd chosen and decided she wanted it. And when we didn't back down, she tried to rewrite history to make us look like the bad guys. And I love my sister, but I'm not going to pretend that's okay." And Rebecca was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Emily, I'm sorry. I didn't know. Jessica has been so upset, and I just assumed I should have asked more questions." Emily's voice softened slightly and she said, "I appreciate that, Rebecca, and I'm not angry at you, but I'm not going to attend a baby shower celebrating Jessica's plan to name her daughter the same name as my actual living daughter, who is currently 6 weeks old." And Rebecca said, "That's fair, that's completely fair. And Emily, I know this might be awkward, but would it be okay if I came by to meet Charlotte sometime? I'd really like to meet my new cousin." Emily looked at me and I nodded, feeling something like hope for the first time in weeks. And Emily said, "We'd like that, Rebecca. We'd really like that." And when she hung up, she came over to the couch and sat next to me and Charlotte and said, "I think that's the first person in my family who's actually questioned Jessica's story." And I said, "Maybe the truth is finally starting to come out." Rebecca came by 3 days later to meet Charlotte and stayed for almost 2 hours, holding her and asking questions about the birth and labor and how we were adjusting to parenthood. And when she left, she hugged both of us and said, "I'm going to talk to some of the other cousins because I don't think everyone knows the real timeline of what happened." And I felt grateful, but also cautious, unsure if one person's realization would make any difference in the larger family narrative that had already solidified around Jessica's version of events. But over the next week, Emily started getting texts from other family members. First, her cousin Amanda, who said, "Rebecca told me what really happened with the name. I'm so sorry we didn't ask more questions. Can I come meet Charlotte?" And then her cousin Michael, who sent a message saying, "Just want you to know I'm on your side. What Jessica did was messed up." And slowly, piece by piece, the truth seemed to be spreading through the extended family in a way we hadn't anticipated or orchestrated. Emily would read me these messages, and I could see the relief on her face, the validation that she hadn't been crazy or unreasonable, that other people could see the manipulation once they knew the actual facts. And she said, "I think people are starting to ask Jessica directly about when she first mentioned the name, and her answers aren't adding up." A week after Rebecca's visit, Emily got a call from her Aunt Maria, her mother's sister, and Maria said, "Emily, I need to tell you something. I was looking through old photos from Jessica's wedding, trying to find one for a family album, and I found a video on my phone from the reception where Jessica is talking about future baby names. And she specifically says she wants to name her daughter Sophia Grace. I heard her say it clear as day. There's no mention of Charlotte Rose at all." And Emily asked if Maria could send her the video, and Maria did, and we watched it together. This clip from 4 years ago of Jessica laughing with bridesmaids and saying, "When Brad and I have kids, I already know what I'm naming them, Sophia Grace for a girl and James Bradley for a boy." And there it was, documentary evidence that directly contradicted Jessica's claim that she'd wanted Charlotte Rose for years. Emily sent the video to Rebecca and Amanda and Michael, and apparently Rebecca sent it to the family group chat that I was still excluded from. And Emily said, "According to Amanda, the chat is exploding. People are asking Jessica to explain. And she's saying she changed her mind after the wedding, but the damage is done. People can see she's been lying." Then Emily's grandmother, her father's mother Eleanor, who was 83 and generally stayed out of family drama, apparently went through her text messages and found a conversation from 3 years ago where Jessica had sent her a Pinterest board of baby name ideas, and Eleanor screenshot it and sent it to Emily, and we looked through Jessica's saved names, and there were dozens of options. Olivia and Emma and Isabella and Ava, traditional and trendy and classic names. But Charlotte wasn't on the list at all, and Rose appeared only once in combination with Penelope Rose, which wasn't even close to what Jessica was now claiming she'd always planned. Eleanor apparently sent those screenshots to the family group chat too, with a message that said, "I don't appreciate being lied to. Jessica told me she'd been planning the name Charlotte Rose since before her wedding, but this evidence suggests otherwise." And Emily said her grandmother was the family matriarch whose word carried significant weight, and if Eleanor was publicly questioning Jessica's story, then other people would feel permission to do the same. Emily showed me some of the messages from the group chat, cousins and aunts and uncles saying things like, "I'm confused about the timeline," and "Why did the story change?" and "I think we owe Emily and Maya an apology." And I read them feeling something that wasn't quite triumph, but more like exhausted vindication, like I'd been carrying a heavy weight for so long, and someone had finally acknowledged it existed. Emily's phone rang constantly that day, with family members calling to apologize, or ask questions, or try to understand what had really happened, and she patiently explained the timeline over and over, how we'd chosen the name 3 years ago, how we'd announced it at our shower, how Charlotte had been born and named before Jessica ever claimed to be pregnant. And I could hear in her voice that she was tired, but also relieved to finally be believed. That night, after Charlotte was asleep, Emily said, "Maya, I need to tell you something. I'm grateful the truth is coming out, but I also feel sad because it means my family believed Jessica over me for weeks without question. They were so ready to think I was the bad guy." And I held her and said, "I know, and that's hard, but at least now they're willing to see the truth." And she nodded against my shoulder and said, "At least now they're willing to see." 8 weeks after Charlotte was born, on a Tuesday afternoon when Emily was at her first day back at work, and I was home alone figuring out the rhythms of solo parenting, the doorbell rang, and I looked through the peephole to see Rose standing on our front porch holding a gift bag, and my first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home, to just stay quiet until she left. But Charlotte chose that moment to start crying from her bassinet, and I knew Rose had heard, so I took a breath and opened the door. Rose looked older than I remembered, more tired, and she said, "Maya, I know I should have called first, but I was afraid you'd tell me not to come, and I really need to talk to you." And I stood there holding the door half open, my daughter crying behind me, trying to decide if I had the emotional energy for whatever this conversation was going to be. I finally said, "Charlotte's crying. I need to get her." And Rose said, "Can I come in?" And I hesitated for just a moment before stepping back and letting her into our home for the first time since before the baby shower, since before everything had fallen apart. I picked up Charlotte from her bassinet, and she settled against my shoulder, and Rose stood in our living room looking at her granddaughter with tears already forming in her eyes. And she said, "Maya, she's beautiful. She looks just like Emily did as a baby." And I said, "Would you like to hold her?" Because whatever my feelings about Rose's behavior over the past 2 months, she was still Charlotte's grandmother, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who weaponized a baby. Rose sat on the couch and I placed Charlotte in her arms, and I watched Rose's face transform as she looked down at her namesake, watched her cry silently while holding this tiny person who carried her name, and Rose said, "Charlotte Rose, oh sweetheart, I'm so sorry I missed the first 8 weeks of your life." And she looked up at me and said, "Maya, I owe you an enormous apology. I got completely caught up in managing Jessica's emotions, and I didn't stop to think about what this name meant to you and Emily. I didn't think about the fact that you'd chosen to honor both your grandmother and me. I just heard Jessica crying, and I went into fix-it mode like I've been doing her entire life." I sat down in the chair across from them and said, "Rose, it hurt that you took her side when you knew the timeline. You knew we'd chosen the name first. You were there when we announced it." And Rose nodded and said, "I know, and I have no excuse except that I've spent 32 years trying to keep Jessica happy, and somewhere along the way, I forgot that her happiness isn't more important than everyone else's. I forgot that giving in to her demands wasn't actually helping her, it was just teaching her that throwing tantrums gets results. She looked back down at Charlotte and said, I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past few weeks, especially since the truth came out about Jessica's lies about when she'd chosen the name. And I realized I've created this dynamic where Jessica thinks she can rewrite reality and everyone will just go along with it because it's easier than dealing with her emotions. And I'm exhausted, Maya. I'm so tired of managing her feelings and walking on eggshells and sacrificing everyone else's happiness to keep her calm. I felt something shift in my chest, some small release of the anger I'd been carrying, because this was what I'd needed to hear, not just an apology, but an acknowledgement of the pattern, a recognition that this wasn't about one name, but about years of enabling behavior. And I said, Rose, I appreciate you saying that, but I need you to understand that the past 8 weeks have been really painful. Emily has been grieving the loss of her family relationships while trying to adjust to being a new parent, and I've been feeling guilty for causing that pain even though I know we didn't do anything wrong. Rose was crying openly now and she said, You didn't do anything wrong. You chose a meaningful name for your daughter, and you stood by that choice when you were pressured to change it. And I'm ashamed that I was part of that pressure. I'm ashamed that I made Emily feel like she had to choose between her wife and her family when there should never have been a choice to make. Charlotte started to fuss, and Rose gently bounced her, natural grandmother instincts taking over, and she said, Maya, I know I can't undo the past 2 months, but I'm asking if we can start over. If you and Emily would be willing to let me be part of Charlotte's life, I promise I'm going to do better. I'm going to stop enabling Jessica and start setting boundaries. And I know that's going to be hard and messy, but I'm ready to do the work. I looked at Rose holding my daughter, and I thought about Emily's face when she talked about missing her mom, thought about Charlotte growing up without knowing her grandmother, and I said, Rose, I think Emily and I need to talk about this together, but I'm willing to try if you're really committed to changing the dynamic. And Rose said, I am. I promise I am. And Maya, there's something else you should know. Jessica's pregnancy has been complicated, not medically but emotionally. Everything is a crisis. Every appointment is dramatic. She's posted about having morning sickness 40 times in the past 6 weeks, and I'm watching her turn this pregnancy into a performance, and I'm realizing that nothing is ever going to be enough for her. She's always going to need to be the center of attention. I asked carefully, how is she handling the fact that the family knows she lied about the name timeline? And Rose sighed and said, she's saying she misremembered when she first thought of it, or that she mentioned it privately to people who just don't recall. She's trying to salvage the narrative, but I think most of the family sees through it now, and I think she's angry at me because I'm not defending her anymore. I told her last week that she needs to apologize to you and Emily, and she said I was choosing you over her, and I said no. I'm choosing honesty over manipulation. We sat in silence for a moment, just the sound of Charlotte's small breaths, and then Rose said, Can I ask what made you choose the name Charlotte? I know it honors your grandmother, but I'd love to hear about her. And I told her about my grandmother Charlotte, who raised me after my parents divorced, who taught me to stand up for myself and not accept less than I deserved, who would have loved to meet her great-granddaughter, and Rose listened and cried and said, She sounds like she was an amazing woman, and I'm honored that my name is paired with hers, truly honored, and I'm sorry I didn't ask about this sooner. I should have wanted to know the meaning instead of just worrying about Jessica's reaction. 10 weeks after Charlotte was born, on a Thursday morning while I was feeding her and scrolling through my phone with my free hand, Emily's phone rang from the kitchen counter, and I heard her answer with, Brad, is everything okay? And then silence. And I could tell from the quality of that silence that something had happened, could hear it in the way Emily said, Oh God, Brad, I'm so sorry. When did it happen? And I felt my stomach drop even before I knew what we were talking about. Some instinct telling me that the landscape was about to shift again in ways I couldn't predict. Emily came into the living room with her phone still pressed to her ear, and she was crying, and she said, "Of course, I'll come over right now, just give me 20 minutes." And when she hung up, she looked at me and said, "Jessica had a miscarriage. She was 11 weeks. Brad said she started bleeding last night, and they went to the emergency room and there was no heartbeat." And I felt a complicated rush of emotions, genuine sadness for the loss of a pregnancy, sympathy for what Jessica must be feeling, but also underneath that, a terrible guilty relief that this particular battle was over, that there wouldn't be another baby named Charlotte Rose, and I hated myself for thinking it, even as I thought it. Emily said, "Brad asked if I could come over. Jessica's asking for me. Do you want to come?" And I shifted Charlotte to my other breast and said, "No, I don't think that's a good idea. My being there would just make things worse. You should go be with your sister." And Emily nodded and said, "Are you sure you're okay here alone?" And I said, "We'll be fine, go. She needs you right now." And I watched Emily grab her keys and jacket and leave. And then it was just me and Charlotte in the quiet house. And I sat there feeling like a terrible person for the relief mixed in with my sympathy. Emily came home 6 hours later looking completely drained, and she collapsed on the couch next to me and put her head in her hands and said, "That was one of the hardest afternoons of my life. Jessica's devastated. She's genuinely grieving. But Maya, she's also performing it. She had her phone out taking pictures of herself crying. She was talking about making a memorial post for the baby. And I know grief looks different for everyone, but it felt like she was already thinking about how to get sympathy from it. And I didn't know what to say to that, because it felt cruel to judge how someone processed a miscarriage. But also, I knew exactly what Emily meant. Knew Jessica's pattern of turning every experience into content for an audience. Emily said, she kept saying things like, "At least I was only 11 weeks. At least I didn't get too attached." But then also talking about the nursery she'd been planning and the clothes she'd bought, and I couldn't tell what was real and what was performance. And then Emily looked at me with exhausted eyes and said, "She said something, Maya. She said, 'At least now Maya didn't steal the name from my actual baby. At least Charlotte Rose was just a fantasy.'" And I lost it. I told her that was a horrible thing to say, that our Charlotte is real and here and healthy, and she looked at me like I was the one being cruel. I felt anger flash through me despite the circumstances, and I said, "Emily, I'm sorry she lost the pregnancy. Truly I am. No one deserves that pain. But that doesn't erase everything she did. It doesn't make it okay that she tried to claim our daughter's name." And Emily said, "I know." And I told her that. I told her she needs to talk to a therapist because this pattern of making everything about her and manipulating family dynamics isn't healthy. And she started crying harder and said I was attacking her while she was grieving. And Brad came in and said maybe I should go, so I left. We sat together in silence, Charlotte asleep between us. And Emily said, "I feel guilty for not feeling worse about the miscarriage. I feel like a terrible sister, but honestly, Maya, mostly what I feel is exhausted. I'm so tired of managing Jessica's emotions and walking on eggshells and never knowing what's real. And I hate that a miscarriage doesn't change any of that. It just adds another layer of complication where I'm not allowed to have boundaries because she's grieving." And I took her hand and said, "You're allowed to have compassion for her loss and still maintain boundaries about her behavior. Those things aren't mutually exclusive." And Emily nodded and said, "I know, but tell that to my family. Rose already texted saying we all need to rally around Jessica now, and I'm sure that means I'm supposed to forget about everything that happened and just focus on supporting her." 4 months after Charlotte was born, on Thanksgiving Day, when the leaves were turning gold and red outside our windows, and the air had that sharp November clarity, Emily and I drove to her parents' house for the first family gathering since everything had happened. And I sat in the passenger seat with my hands folded in my lap, trying to breathe through the anxiety, while Charlotte dozed peacefully in her car seat behind us, blissfully unaware that this was the first time her mother and her aunt would be in the same room since that awful phone call in the hospital. Emily reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "We can leave any time you want. Just say the word and we're out of there." And I nodded and said, "I know, I'm okay. I think I need to do this." And I meant it because I'd realized over the past 4 months that I was tired of avoiding things, tired of managing other people's emotions at the expense of my own peace. And I wanted to walk into that house holding my daughter and not feel like I'd done anything wrong. Rose answered the door and hugged both of us. And she'd been over to our house 3 times since that first visit, and things were still careful between us, but getting better. And she took Charlotte from my arms and said, "Oh, sweetheart, you've gotten so big," and led us into the living room where the whole family was gathered, aunts and uncles and cousins. And I saw Jessica sitting on the couch next to Brad, and our eyes met for just a second before she looked away. The afternoon unfolded in that awkward way that family gatherings do when there's unresolved tension simmering under the surface, people making small talk and passing dishes and carefully navigating around the obvious elephant in the room. And I noticed that several cousins went out of their way to come meet Charlotte and tell us how beautiful her name was. And Emily's Aunt Maria held her and said, "Charlotte Rose, what a perfect name, so much meaning." And I saw Jessica's jaw tighten from across the room. It wasn't until after dinner, when people were scattered throughout the house in small conversational clusters, that Jessica approached where I was sitting in the corner of the living room with Charlotte in my arms. And she stood there for a moment before saying, "Can I hold her?" And I hesitated for just a second before saying, "Of course," and passing my daughter to her aunt. Jessica held Charlotte carefully, looking down at her with an expression I couldn't quite read, and she said quietly, "She's beautiful, Maya. She really is." And I said, "Thank you." And we sat in uncomfortable silence until Jessica said, "Brad and I are taking a break from trying to conceive. We're seeing a therapist, both of us together and me individually. My doctor said I need to work on some things before we try again." And I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded, and Jessica continued. "The therapist asked me why I needed the name so badly, why it mattered so much, and I couldn't really answer her. I just kept saying it wasn't fair that you got it first. And she asked me what first had to do with it, and I didn't have an answer for that either." I watched Jessica's face as she looked at my daughter, and I saw something that might have been genuine self-awareness, might have been the beginning of actual change, and she said, "I'm not ready to apologize yet. I'm still angry about a lot of things, but my therapist says I need to work on accepting that other people's choices aren't about me, that you naming your daughter Charlotte Rose wasn't something you did to hurt me, it was something you did for your family." And she handed Charlotte back to me and walked away before I could respond. Emily found me a few minutes later and said, "I saw you talking to Jessica. Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I am. I think maybe she's starting to understand some things." And Emily sat next to me and put her arm around my shoulders and said, "Even if she never fully gets it, we're going to be okay. We have our family, and that's what matters." I looked around the room at Emily's family, at Rose holding court in the kitchen, at David playing with his nephew's kids, at all these people who had slowly come around to accepting that our Charlotte Rose was the real Charlotte Rose, the only Charlotte Rose. And I realized that I didn't need their acceptance anymore, that somewhere over the past 4 months, I'd stopped waiting for external validation and started trusting my own judgment. Charlotte made a small sound and opened her eyes and looked up at me with that unfocused infant gaze that seemed to see right into my soul. And I thought about my grandmother Charlotte, who had raised me to stand up for myself, who had taught me that being kind didn't mean being a doormat, who would have loved this little girl so much. And I thought about how choosing my daughter's name had been about more than just the name itself. It had been about choosing to prioritize my own family's meaning and history over someone else's demands. It had been about teaching my daughter from day one that she didn't have to make herself smaller to accommodate other people's outsized emotions. Emily squeezed my hand and said, "What are you thinking about?" And I said, "I'm thinking about how much I love our daughter's name, how perfectly it suits her, how glad I am that we didn't change it." And Emily smiled and kissed my temple and said, "Me too. I can't imagine her being called anything else." As the afternoon turned to evening and we started gathering our things to leave, Charlotte rose sleeping peacefully in her carrier. I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't even realized was unsettled, a sense of rightness about the choices we'd made, and the boundaries we'd held, and the family we were building. Rose walked us to the door and hugged us both and said, "Come over Sunday for lunch, just the five of us. David wants to spend more time with his granddaughter." And I said, "We'd like that." And I meant it because I'd learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It just meant choosing to move forward without carrying the weight of anger. We drove home through the dark November evening with Charlotte sleeping in the back seat, and I looked over at Emily and said, "I'm proud of us. I'm proud that we stood our ground." And Emily said, "I'm proud of you, Maya. You knew what mattered and you didn't let anyone convince you otherwise." And I felt tears prick my eyes because that was exactly what I'd needed to hear, needed to know. That standing firm in what was right wasn't selfish or cruel. It was necessary. When we got home and I was changing Charlotte into her pajamas, I looked down at my daughter and said, "Charlotte Rose Martinez Chen, you are named for two strong women who knew their worth. And I promise to teach you to know yours too. I promise to show you that being kind doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, that loving your family doesn't mean sacrificing yourself, that your needs and feelings matter just as much as anyone else's." And Charlotte looked up at me with those serious infant eyes and made a small cooing sound. And I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever family drama might resurface in the future, I had learned something fundamental about myself in these past 4 months. I had learned that I was strong enough to stand alone if I had to, and that knowledge was worth more than any amount of external approval. Emily came into the nursery and wrapped her arms around both of us and said, "My two favorite people in the whole world." And I leaned back against her and looked at our daughter and felt a peace I hadn't felt in months. Not because everything was perfect or because all the family relationships had been magically healed, but because I had finally learned to validate myself instead of waiting for someone else to do it, and that made all the difference.